There were a number of motions filed by Donna Adelson's legal defense team. And one of the motions was to switch courtrooms because they were alleging that some people in the courtroom in the gallery were signaling to the jury or allegations like that. And therefore they want to go to a smaller courtroom. That's most likely going to be denied. There was another motion, which was a little bit more interesting, which is the motion to dismiss based on pre-indictment delay. Because the government waited so long to indict Donna Adelson from the time of the murder till now. So they're arguing that therefore it's pre-indictment delay. It violates her due process rights and privileges under the Constitution, and therefore they want the case dismissed. We analyzed that motion to dismiss in my last video. If you haven't seen that yet, definitely go check that out if you want to understand really the law behind pre-indictment delay and see whether there's any merit into that motion itself. Now, there's another motion, and that's going to be the focus of today's video. The third motion that was filed is in respect to Donna Adelson fleeing to Vietnam. And everyone's already seen that video of her trying to get onto the flight and being arrested on the airplane, essentially. So the prosecution is obviously going to want to admit that as evidence and then argue that shows consciousness of guilt. Why is she trying to fly to Vietnam, a non-extradition country, right when we're about to charge her, right after Charlie Adelson was convicted? Why is she doing that? Obviously, consciousness of guilt. So this motion requests that the prosecution, number one, be precluded from admitting any sort of evidence of her flight to Vietnam, and number two, that they should not be allowed to argue that is consciousness of guilt. So is there any merit to this motion? Is this just another frivolous motion that's being filed by the defense or not? So we're going to, of course, jump into the law and see if there's any merit into this any of these arguments that the defense is making, and we're going to analyze it like we always do. So first, here is an important quote from a case that deals with consciousness of guilt. Like anything, it's not all or nothing. It's not like they can always argue consciousness of guilt by anything that a person does. Any action that a person takes, they obviously can't argue, oh, that shows consciousness of guilt, right? That's obvious. So the court has to figure out, when are we going to allow some evidence of consciousness of guilt? So this is what the case Williams versus State says. It says the following: the probative value of evidence of flight is weakened if, number one, the suspect was not aware at the time of the flight that he was a suspect in an investigation of the charged crimes. So was Donna Adelson aware that when she was taking that flight, that she was a suspect in an investigation for this crime, this murder of Dan Markel? That's the first question. Number two, there were not clear indications of flight. So that's another prong that weakens the argument. If there is no clear indications that this is you fleeing, maybe this is just you taking a vacation, maybe this is just going to visit your grandchildren, whatever other argument you can make, that's the second prong. And number three, there was a significant delay in time between the flight and the commission of the crime. So these three things weaken the argument that a prosecutor can make about consciousness of guilt. So the third one is, again, if there is a significant delay in time between the flight and the commission of the crime. Now, remember, the crime here was committed in 2014, and this is 9 years later. So that's certainly going to be an argument that the defense is going to make in this case. All right, so now let's jump into their motion, and we're going to analyze it like we always do. So this is what they argue. Number one, Professor Markel was murdered on July 18th, 2014. Within days of the murder, Donna Adelson was a prime suspect of the state. And in April 2016, the state organized an undercover operation against Donna Adelson known as the Bump, which made it clear to Mrs. Adelson that she was a major target of the state's investigation. This became even clearer after the arrests of others over the many years and the release to the public of the state's theory of the case, which put Mrs. Adelson at the center of the state's conspiracy theory. In all that time, Mrs. Adelson traveled all over the world. So during that time, Mrs. Adelson, Donna Adelson, was traveling all over the place, including to countries without extradition, and always returned. It was not until after Charles Adelson's conviction in November 2023 did the state arrest her upon boarding a flight to Dubai with its ultimate destination, Vietnam. Because of the time and manner of the travel as described below, the evidence should not be permitted as evidence of consciousness of guilt. Where there is little physical evidence linking a defendant to a crime, as it is in this case, this type of flight evidence needs to be looked at more carefully because a jury is more likely to place more weight on it. In fact, Florida appellate courts have ordered new trials after finding that flight evidence should have been excluded under such a 403 analysis, and that is the case of Williams versus State, which we started off with, that in that case, they felt that the prosecutor was not allowed to argue consciousness of guilt based on what happened in that case of evidence of flight. Most courts look to a 4-part test to determine whether to exclude flight evidence. Generally, the analysis for flight evidence frames the 4-part test in this way. Circumstantial evidence suggesting consciousness of guilt usually invites 4 inferences. First, the observed behavior suggests flight. So number 1, is your behavior consistent with flight? Number 2, second, flight suggests a guilty mind or conscience, which may mean nothing more than a desire to avoid detection, rather than any feeling of remorse or sense of wrongdoing. So here, the second inference that needs to be made is that the flight suggests a guilty mind. Not just that you're trying to avoid detection. This is how the defense, is framing this second prong, which is not so simple at all. Third, consciousness of guilt suggests that the person is conscious of his involvement in the charged crime. Fourth, and finally, consciousness of guilt for the charged crime suggests actual guilt of the charged crime. Each inference depends on its own general premise or evidential hypothesis. However, this chain of inferences, so you have to go through these inferences one at a time and see if it applies to your case. So this chain of inferences breaks when a defendant can provide an alternative explanation for the flight other than consciousness of guilt. So in other words, evidence of flight is inadmissible when there are independent reasons for flight, as those independent reasons tend to break the second and third links of this chain. So this whole chain of inferences that you have to make, number 1, was the person actually fleeing? Number 2, the list of inferences that we just went through, it breaks if you can show that you had an independent reason for taking that flight. Meaning if you're just going to visit your grandchildren, so then obviously you're not trying to flee from prosecution. You're just trying to visit. Or if you're going on vacation, or if you want to just visit Vietnam, because that's what you're in the mood of now. So that would break the chain of inferences. Now they cite a case, which is interesting. They cite this case from Mississippi. For example, meaning the reason why they're going to Mississippi is because they didn't find any cases in Florida that would be similar to what happened with Donna Adelson. So that right away is a little bit of a red flag. It's not completely dispositive, but certainly once you see that they're going to other jurisdictions to give examples, kind of shows you that in Florida, they didn't really have such great examples. All right. Well, anyway, let's go through this anyway. For example, consider a case from the Mississippi Supreme Court called Fuserlin. In that case, the Mississippi Supreme Court held it was error to admit flight evidence because the defendant had an independent reason for flight that was not probative of his guilt or guilty knowledge. In that case, listen to this. In that case, the defendant had escaped from prison. When law enforcement arrived at his home 2 days after a murder occurred, he fled the scene. So you have to keep in mind that what happened in that case is that you had an individual who escaped from a prison. So he already escaped from a prison. Now he's also being charged with murder. So he already escaped from prison, and now they want to charge him with murder. And he ran. In that case, the defendant had escaped from prison. When law enforcement arrived at his home 2 days after a murder occurred, he fled the scene. The state attempted to admit evidence of his flight to show consciousness of guilt for the murder. They were allowed to. He was found guilty. The court overturned the ruling. Based on the unique circumstances of his case, the court found that the flight may have been probative of his guilty knowledge of the murder, but it was equally, if not more, probative of his desire to remain out of prison as an escapee. So why was he running away from the police? In that case, why was he running away? Was he running away because he had consciousness of guilt that he committed this murder? Or was he running away because he just escaped from jail and he wants to stay out of jail? So since there is a strong enough reason to say that he was running because he didn't want to go back to jail. Nothing to do with whether he's being charged with murder or not. So if that's an independent reason for him fleeing, so that was what the Mississippi Supreme Court found. The prosecution cannot argue consciousness of guilt because, again, there's an independent reason why he was fleeing. Now they say another case, and then we're going to analyze whether these cases apply to our situation. Relatedly, consider a Nevada Supreme Court case called Guy versus State. Now, this is a case in Nevada. In that case, a criminal defendant involved in many criminal activities was suspected of murder. 13 days after the murder, he fled the police as they approached him. The court held that, given appellant's criminal proclivities, there are numerous possibilities as to why he fled from the police on April 20th, 1990. It is speculative to assert that he fled because of a consciousness of guilt and fear of arrest arising out of the killing. So in that case, what happened was, here you have a person, he's being charged with murder, but he was also had a lot of other criminal activities that he was involved in. So when they came to arrest him specifically for murder and he ran, how do you know that he's running because he just committed a murder? Maybe he's running because he's did all these other crimes. So since in that case also the court found it's very reasonable for him to be fleeing, not because of the specific charge of murder, but because of the other crimes that he was committing. So the point that they're trying to bring from this is that if there's an independent reason, if there's some other reason why that person is going on that flight, then the prosecution should be precluded from arguing that that flight shows consciousness of guilt. So let's hear how they argue it in Donna Adelson's case. Here, the evidence is clear, even in jail calls that the state marked as evidence, that Donna Adelson was not fleeing and was not leaving because she had a guilty conscience about being involved in the murder of Professor Markell. She did not hide her travel. She applied for a visa with the State Department. She spoke about her travel openly with friends. A ticket was booked in her name, not an alias, at her local airport, and she used her own passport. Indeed, her travel was open and notorious. Moreover, and possibly more significantly, if Donna Adelson was fleeing because of a guilty conscience, she would have fled nearly a decade ago, when it was clear that she was a main target and suspect. She would have fled during the trials of Catherine Magbanua, when the state made it clear that Donna Adelson was a centerpiece of its case. She would have left when Charles Adelson was arrested in April 2022. The fact that she stayed here, traveled abroad, and always returned weighs against any finding that her trip in November 2023, years after the murder and years after Charles Adelson's indictment, stemmed from a guilty conscience and not some other innocent reason. So here, the argument here is that, number one, the time delay. And as we spoke about in the case law says that certainly is a factor that the court has to weigh. The fact that there was a significant delay in the time between the flight and the commission of the crime. That is a factor that the court has to weigh. So they're arguing this is not someone fleeing. This is just someone taking a random vacation after her son was just convicted of murder. And she just wanted to take a trip to Vietnam, which just so happens to be a non-extradition country. But she already took other flights during this whole past 9 years where she went to even some non-extradition countries. And again, this is just what they're saying in their motion. Is there any evidence of that? We're not sure. They didn't attach any evidence, but that's what they're arguing. So they're arguing again that this is a lady who always takes trips to non-extradition countries, and it's already 9 years after the crime, which is certainly a factor that the court has to weigh. And therefore, we can't assume that the reason that she was taking that flight to Vietnam was because she had a conscience of guilt. So this is what essentially their argument is. Now, the fact that Donna Adelson was very open about her traveling, right, could also mean that she's just not that smart. And she should have kept it more quiet if she really was planning this. It's possible that she was just talking because she talks. But they're using that as an argument to say, well, if she's trying to hide, then why would she talk openly about her plans? Now, is this actually going to win the day? Most likely not. And part of the reason for that is that she was also Googling on her phone non-extradition countries. So why is that specific factor or fact important to her? If she's just randomly taking a vacation, why would she care about non-extradition countries? So it's a nice try, but this is not going to be granted, most likely. And again, those other cases where you had Mississippi and you had the Nevada case, those cases where in Mississippi, he escaped from jail. So there is a very strong, reasonable conclusion that he's trying to stay out of jail, not because he just committed a murder. It's because he doesn't want to go back to jail. And number two, in the Nevada case, this was a person who was charged with who committed a bunch of different crimes. So how can you tell me for sure that he's fleeing because of the murder charges, opposed to all the other charges and all of his other criminal activities? So that's also a very strong inference. But here, where all of a sudden she's one of the only Adelsons left after all of this, and you're right, it's been a 9-year delay, but she's watching how this is all playing out. And you're right, if she was smarter, she probably would have escaped earlier or tried to escape earlier. But still, she could feel the heat from the police. She can feel that she's next. And why would she otherwise be Googling non-extradition countries? So it's a nice try, and it's an interesting discussion of the law, but most likely, very, very most likely, this motion is going nowhere in a hurry, and this evidence most likely will be admitted. So that is the next motion that the Donna Adelson legal team filed. We'll see if they file any other motions. The trial is quickly approaching, and we'll also, of course, take a look at what the prosecutor's response is to these motions. That should be interesting also. And as we discussed the other motion to dismiss, we're going to have a hearing on all of this. So that will also be interesting to watch. Well, that is it for now. Thank you all for watching. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, like, drop a comment, and we will see you next time.